everyone to the plenary on reclaiming our democracy, resistance, and renewal. I want to hear everybody say resistance and renewal. Ready? Resistance and renewal. We need that as we're fighting for our democracy in this country. My name is Osprey, Orielle Lake, and I am the Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, and I also work with the Global Alliance for Rights of Nature. And we have a star here on stage with us who's going to teach us everything. Do you want to say hi and say good morning? Hi, say hi, baby. Huh? So our future generations mean everything to us. I'm really glad that you're here with us. I'm about to introduce the panelists. I'm just here to moderate, but I wanted to kind of contextualize this particular plenary. Earlier this year when the Soil Not Oil Steering Committee met, it was right after the election of the new administration, I'll just put it that way. And we were all really reeling from the election results, as I'm sure many of you were. And so, you know, what did this mean for our diverse movements and our advocacy efforts? And so this is one of the reasons we wanted to have this session during the conference, because, you know, the question is really how do we continue our work if we don't have a functioning democracy? And we think it's really vital for all of the work that's going on around food sovereignty, carbon sequestration in soils, fighting against GMOs, protecting Indigenous rights, and all of these issues that are so core to us. So how do we reclaim and renew our democracy, I think is a really important conversation that we're going to have this morning. And you know, what are we going to do in this political environment, and how are we going to address our governance structure so that at minimum we really have an opportunity to fight for justice and the well-being of people and planet. And clearly we have a long ways to go. So I'm very excited about this conversation with these really awesome leaders, so we can really have a robust conversation with all of you about this critical juncture in our country and how we're going to really be dealing with this oppressive government now that we're many months in. And I think we're looking at this in the face of climate catastrophes. We all know what's going on right now with our sisters and brothers in Houston and in Florida, and of course all over the world. We're seeing massive flooding and fires, and you know, we need to be addressing these issues, but to do that we need to have our democracy. We also know that we have issues of patriarchy, neoliberal capitalism, white supremacy, environmental racism. All of these things are pressing in on our communities, and of course the list goes on. And since the Women's March at the beginning of the year in Washington, D.C., protesting the election of Donald Trump, as you know, it was the largest march in U.S. history, which I think it's really amazing to remember what women are doing and how central they are to these issues. Since then, I don't know about all of you, but pretty much every week there's another protest that we're asked to go out on the streets for, all these incredible assaults that are happening that really require us to do ever more. And you know, how are we all staying balanced in the midst of this? It is a challenge. But I am very hopeful in the sense of seeing so many more people awakened and active than we've ever seen. And as so many frontline communities have told us, you know, for them, a lot of things actually haven't changed in this new administration. They were already facing all of these issues beforehand. So now we have the opportunity to have so many more people engaged, and we need to do so. Because we are, you know, in my book, in the fight for our lives, literally. So this is going to require a lot of strategic planning over the next years, a lot of solidarity and action between different groups. We really need to work in different sectors and not be in our silos and connect in ways we never have. In this context, I'm really honored to open up this conversation with this outstanding panel so we can really learn from the roadmaps that they have been exploring in reclaiming our democracy and give us a deeper analysis of this political moment and how we can organize and so much more. So with that, I'll start on the end there with Sharon Lungo. She's the executive director of the Ruckus Society, and she's been a trainer with them since 2001. And she's a founding member of the Indigenous Peoples Power Project and is on the advisory board and a key member of the Ruckus staff since 2007. Sharon has an unwavering commitment to holding a racial justice analysis within nonviolent direct action organizing and implementation, and has extensive experience working with grassroots frontline communities and big NGOs alike. And the scope of her more than 18 years of political and nonviolent direct action experience range from local to national to international. And she is the daughter of migrant parents from the Pipil Nation, who are indigenous peoples of El Salvador. So let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you so much for being with us, Sharon. And next to Sharon is Richy Shroff. She is the director of Navdanya International, which is now based in Rome, Italy, which is the international arm of Navdanya, which, as probably many of you know, is Vandana Shiva's founding organization, and we were so honored to have Vandana here several nights ago. It's an organization headquartered in India, which has been working for over 30 years towards the conservation and rejuvenation of agrobiodiversity, traditional knowledge, and a transition towards a food system that ensures ecological sustainability, climate resilience, health and nutrition, equity, and social justice. Ruchi coordinates the international programs and campaigns related to seed freedom. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that program, and food sovereignty, as well as resistance to GMOs and free trade agreements. She has worked for over a decade with social movements in the defense and protection of the environment, as well as democratic rights of minorities and indigenous communities. Let's go ahead and welcome Ruchi. Thank you so much for being with us. And sitting next to me, I'm very honored to introduce Drew Dellinger. He is an internationally known speaker, writer, poet, and teacher who has lectured and taught extensively across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. He is the author of the award-winning poetry collection, Love Letter to the Milky Way, and the upcoming book, Martin Luther King, Ecological Thinker Toward a Cosmology of Connection. Drew has lectured and taught at numerous colleges and universities, and he has been called a national treasure by Joanna Macy, a deep and courageous poet by Alice Walker, and one of the most creative, courageous, and prophetic voices of the generation by Cornel West. So let's give Drew a big hand. Welcome all of you. So with that, I'm going to jump into our first question for our speakers, which is, in the work that you're doing, what does resistance to this political moment look like, and what analysis and actions can you offer us? And I'm going to just start right here on the end with Sharon. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, everybody. So, again, my name is Sharon, and I work with the Ruckus Society. So you all can imagine, right, that we're not the only ones that are kind of shaking in our boots and asking ourselves, what do we do at this time, and how do we respond to crisis that continues to unfold every day, right? Every day, something new. And direct action is not new for our communities. Direct action is something we say we've been taking on since 1492, since colonizers landed here on these lands, right? Our own people here in Huichin, the Ohlone people, are resisting and taking action on a daily basis to defend their homelands, to remind us, that we're living on stolen land. But I'd say the movement right now is we're asking ourselves a lot of questions and asking ourselves, how do we take the tactics and the strategies that we know and apply them to what is happening at this time, right? How do we apply the strategies and the tactics that we have to supporting our brothers and sisters in Texas who are going to have to be dealing with the aftermath of Harvey, and, just want to lift up that after Katrina, organizing communities engaged in direct action formed the Common Ground Collective and went out to New Orleans to help the community rebuild. And that's one way that we can apply our skills and the strategies and the tools that we've learned in direct action towards directly supporting our communities. But I'd say it's a time really to be thinking about multi-pronged strategies. And we're watching the work that we've done over years and years and decades just be stripped away, with the stroke of a pen, or with someone's decision. We hear about how in Texas, right, environmental regulations were relaxed right before Harvey, and now we're seeing, chemical plants explode, and we're going to see the aftermath and effects that are going to last for decades and possibly centuries in our communities. I know you have a lot to say, don't you? But there's a lot of forms and ways to use direct action. I just want to lift up a couple of examples. One thing in particular with Indigenous communities, but also other communities, is harnessing the power of our culture and traditional ways. So lifting up the Unistoten clan of the Wet'suwet'en Nation up in northern British Columbia, right, who are building traditional homes and gardens and community directly in the path of TransCanada, Enbridge, and Chevron. Right, who are reclaiming their home territory in a traditional way, who are exercising their traditional values and knowledge and beliefs to resist a pipeline that's coming their way. Go farther south and we see that they're building tiny houses, right, in the way of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Not exactly a traditional form of building or a traditional house, but an adaptation of that concept, right? And let's put homes, let's put things that people actually need in the path of these pipelines, right? How do we actually fulfill our needs while resisting, major corporations that are coming to take our land away? We're seeing a rising response to fascism and white supremacy, right? And are taking our skills to the streets to fight the Klan and to fight the fascists who are coming into our communities, who have been really emboldened by 45 and his policies, right? And we're seeing people do direct interventions, right? And so we're seeing people all over the South take down statues, right? And doing direct interventions to take these horrible symbols of racism, out of our people's ways, so that we don't have to be reminded on a daily basis of the foundations of this country and everything that we're fighting for. But also using that in a symbolic nature. Just last week, the organization Mi Gente made a mock statue of Jeff Sessions, took it to DC, and then, pulled this mock statue down. A very, very symbolic way of kind of extending, let's take Jeff Sessions down, right? Not just symbolically, but literally, right? And just to show him that that's what we're planning to do, right? We're here to take you down. And so we're going to show you how to do it. And what we're seeing is the rise of grassroots communities taking those kinds of actions. We just finished up a training in Portland with a community organization called OPAL, Organizing People, Advancing Leaders, who are talking about how to use direct action in a place of resiliency, and how to not just fight off the fascists who are calling for white supremacist rallies in their communities this weekend, but how do we take the skills and the leadership that we've instilled in our people and that our people, have intrinsically, and take that and not just fight the fascists with it, but take it to a place of, how do we claim space for our community? How do we claim land for our community? How do we start to build the future that we want to see, right? More and more our communities are saying, and Wet'suwet'en and those nations are a prime example of this, that we can't wait for other people, that it's up to us at this time to build the future that we want. Just here locally, Occupy the Farm, the Guild Track, right? That's an example, right? Props to everybody in this room, that's been out to the Guild Track and was a part of that, right? That's an example of our community wanting to take back land, that doesn't need to be manipulated, that doesn't need to be hurt, that's stolen land, right? And put something good there, put something that's gonna feed our community, that's gonna nurture our community, and that's gonna develop our community. That's another application of direct action in a time like this, and another way that, we're bringing our democracy back to ourselves. Also wanted to lift up direct actions that, point out the intersectionality of our issues. So a couple of years ago, a young brother in San Francisco named Alex Nieto was murdered by the San Francisco PD for eating a burrito on a hill, right? Because, a gentrifier called the police on him because how dare you be a brown person eating a burrito on a hill near a white person's home, right? And so when folks decided to take this issue to the streets, not only did they want to hold the police accountable, but they wanted to lift up the issue of gentrification and tie gentrification directly to police violence, Tie gentrification to the violence in our communities. Tie it to environmental justice issues. And so, folks took over the street in front of the Mission Police Station, and they stopped a Google bus, that was picking people up for work. They set up a mock trial against these police officers, but they also lifted up all of the issues that are happening in San Francisco that are directly related to this police violence, that are the root causes of this kind of violence. So really this is the time to apply everything that we know and everything that we've learned to everything that's happening, right? Because every day we're in crisis, every day something new is changing, every day something that we've worked really hard for is being taken from us. And I can't underscore enough that direct action is nothing without organizing. Right? Without the daily work of all of our organizers and the daily work of each of you talking to your neighbors, talking about racism, talking about environmental justice, talking about social justice, having that conversation and building power in our communities is what's fundamental to making direct action work. Right? Direct action can serve a purpose for direct intervention, right? We want to take down these statues so these symbols of racism don't exist. But direct action can also help us reclaim land. Direct action can also help us to remind people of the kind of society that we want to live in. And just to lift up, we throw the word democracy around a lot, but there are a lot of different kinds of ways that people in our societies live, and a lot of different ways that communities choose to govern themselves. And part of all this is respecting the autonomy of our communities, respecting traditional forms of governance, traditional ceremonies and traditional ways of thinking, and reclaiming some of that thought and applying it towards the modern day, right? Nobody's saying we're going to go back to living those old ways. We like our modern conveniences, and, we like our technology, and I'm not going to lie, I like Facebook, right? But, within that, we can find ways to live this life without hurting each other. Just a prop in advance to all the people that are going to go out and help in the recovery efforts towards all the crisis that's happening right now, right? All the excess of water that's hitting our communities in the same way that a lack of water is affecting our communities. And all the skills, everything that we've learned, through direct action, through organizing, that's all going to be applicable now at this time. So really what our communities are talking about is like, we've been putting the pedal to the metal, but, we got to crank up the gas a little bit, and maybe that's a bad metaphor. We're talking about gas and all that, but that's what came to mind. We're going to pedal the bike faster. How's that? So, at this time, I think what our communities are calling for is diverse strategies, is more organizing and a call to really force ourselves to apply the things that we want and really, really not just vision the future, but put that future into action. Yeah.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Osprey, and all of you for inviting me here. You're so right. Every passing day, there's a new crisis, and the interconnected nature of the multiple crises that we face is also becoming clearer and clearer. So the ecological crisis, the social and political crisis, as well as the economic crisis. The ecological crisis is very evident. It's already here. We are seeing the devastation already with the hurricanes here. In India and in South Asia, the flooding recently has killed over 1,200 people and displaced millions, which has not made as many headlines. There is a deep, deep, deep agrarian crisis in all of South Asia once again. And you would have heard of the farmer suicides, over 320,000 farmers committing suicide over the last 10 years. So that is one aspect of the ecological and the agricultural crisis. And then the political and the social crisis. We've had in India over the last 3 years now, not just an authoritarian government, a far-right authoritarian government, but far-right extremism now slowly becoming a mass movement. Just 4 days ago, a very senior journalist was shot and killed right outside her home for expressing views against the government. This is the 4th such murder of intellectuals, writers, journalists in the last period itself. And this was followed by widespread celebration of, and a warning by not just the state and its supporters, but also MPs saying that if you dissent, if you speak against the state, we will come after you. Up till now, we were living with threats, and now there is direct violence happening. This is coupled with mob lynchings against the Muslim community, against Dalits, against the minority communities for their eating habits, for their cultural habits, for their economic activities. There is a complete takeover of almost every institution in Indian society right now, be it the university, the media. Surprisingly here, even the New York Times suddenly gets a spine when it has to, is able to criticize Trump. But most of the mainstream media has either colluded with the government or is terrorized into submission. Universities, schools changing their history textbooks, students not able to express themselves freely. There is severe clampdown. So we are really in a fight for our life as far as democracy is concerned in India. And with a sort of a poison that is already penetrating society. So the kind of actions that we will need to look at, there is resistance, and I'll come to that in a second too. So I wanted to spend a minute on the aspects of what is also happening in other parts of the world. And then the other dimension of the crisis of democracy is also the corporate, or the corporate agribusiness, or the corporate collusion with authoritarian governments. So if we look at, say, for example, in the space of agribusiness, where now 3 corporations will control over 60% of our seeds or 70% of our agri-chemicals. That is also a crisis of our democracy, when monopoly control starts to take over our entire food and agricultural systems, where those that need to be regulated start writing our laws. There is a crisis of democracy. So there are seed laws that are being imposed all over the world. In India, here, I was reading the other day, I think 29 states have passed a seed preemption law, which will impede counties or local cities to make their own seed laws, like GMO bans or seed laws. It's here. In Malawi, in India, laws that are being imposed through either trade agreements or sheer control over government or weak governments that make farmers' seeds illegal. So this in itself is also a crisis of democracy, when corporate control starts taking over our commons, our resources in the commons, which is our seeds and biodiversity, our water, and our food systems. So as decision-making starts getting centralized away from local communities into the hands of national or regional governments, and then ultimately into corporate boardrooms or financial institutions, there is a crisis of democracy. So if we look at this fact of democracy, of corporate globalization, which is seen as an aggressive privatization or a takeover of our commons, whether it is land, seed, or water, or knowledge, when communities begin to express their sovereignty and act on that sovereignty, that is the most powerful response to this corporate takeover of our democracies. So, and this is also happening throughout the world, not just in India. Whether it is farmers all over the world, many parts of the world, saying that we will not follow these seed laws that make our seeds illegal. We refuse to follow such laws that make the saving of seed, the breeding of seed, the exchange of seed illegal. That is the big response. Our organizations or communities that are working with us are saving seeds, keeping seeds in farmers' hands. We have about 120 community seed banks where we are saving thousands of varieties of rice and vegetables. We are working towards this getting rid of this model of agriculture that is now, where just 3 or 4 giants are producing 3 commodities, and where seed and food is now in their control. We are working towards an agricultural model, working with local communities and villages, where seeds, not only seeds are in farmers' hands, but the agriculture that is being practiced is non-violent, in harmony with the nature. That is at the level of community. So these actions are being created everywhere, not just in India, but everywhere in the world. And communities all over the world, like what Sharon spoke about, in India, communities have fought against big mining companies and won. A recent example is of communities in Orissa, indigenous communities called the Dongriya Kond, which fought against the mining company called Vedanta and won. 7 years, communities in another coastal town of Orissa fought against another steel giant from South Korea. 7 years, women and children at the front lines did not allow the company to enter or even put one brick. They finally succeeded in winning. So wherever resources or wherever communities' resources or seed or land or water are being threatened, they are fighting back. And our challenge is, how do we join them and how do we connect these various resistances? Thank you.
All right. So, these are huge questions and very complicated. And I think we need to be able to think on multiple levels in terms of having a long-term, mid-term, and short-term strategy, in terms of having an inside-outside strategy that both works within the electoral process and pressures the electoral process from without. So I think part of the challenge that we're faced with right now at the moment is to deal with the fact that the status quo prior to 2016 was unacceptable. I mean, it was a social justice nightmare. It was an impending ecological catastrophe. And yet, things can get worse. And things did get worse in terms of the election of Donald Trump. So I think it's, we can be kind of jaded and be like, oh, well, there were problems before Donald Trump. Yeah, there were. And I think we need to recognize what's different about what's happening now, because there's nothing strategic or spiritual or ennobling about denial, about being in denial about the challenges we're facing. And so I think, it's a complicated thing. How do we talk about the new challenges we face with the Trump administration and some of the other dynamics that have come along with it during the campaign and since, without, pretending that the electoral process has all the answers, or that Democrats are going to be our saviors, or that the status quo was acceptable. So I think it's hard to even have this conversation. We're in a ridiculous scenario. I mean, there's an immense amount of absurdity when I feel like I have to get on a stage and hold a microphone and say that Nazism is bad. I mean, we're in a profoundly disorienting moment. And so I just wanted to kind of be real and say it's hard to even begin to frame one's thoughts when there's so much that we're dealing with. The general thing that I have been saying for 10, 15, 20 years is that we need to build movements. We need to continue to build and strengthen these movements that connect ecology, social justice, and cosmology, or worldview. I think some of you, cosmology is not a super familiar word in general, but I think a lot of you have a sense of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what's the cultural story? What's the narrative? What's the big story? What's the worldview? What are the unquestioned assumptions that are operating in the culture? And so I think if we look to the roots of these ecological and these social crises, we begin to need to ask those questions. What's the worldview? What are some of the deep principles that are operating on a meta level and flowing between these ecological and these social injustices? Deep principles such as personhood, reverence, respect. Are we treating human communities, ecological communities, with reverence and respect, or are we treating them as objects to be exploited, as resources to be commodified, right? So I think there's some deep principles that have to do with our worldview, with our cultural story, with our narrative, with our paradigm, with our cosmovision, with our cosmology, right? So this is why I include this. Of course we need to integrate ecology and social justice. I think we also have to look at what's the worldview that's operating in the culture. So I say we need to build a movement that connects ecology, social justice, and cosmology or worldview. And we need to build that movement using the powers of dream, the power of story, the power of art, and the power of action. It's very important that we have all of those, because when we talk about dream, again, that gets down to the level of cosmology. What's the underlying principle, worldview of the culture? How do we even think about our role as human beings on this planet? Are we here to consume? Are we here to compete? Are we here to engage in the maximization of wealth and profit? Or are we here to celebrate? Are we here to commune with each other? Are we here to connect and to be creative? You see, so I think we're in a real, we're in a moment where the cultural story is up for grabs. And we all need to be artists and weavers of the new and emerging cultural stories, right? Let me just say that in terms of resistance, so I think in terms of resistance, we're also in a powerful moment where we're seeing some very powerful emerging social movements. The movement for Black Lives. The movement for Black Lives is the most significant action for racial justice that we've seen in this country in the last 50 years. It's tremendously significant. We all need to support this movement. So part of what I think resistance looks like, thank you, in this moment is for white folks to recognize and support the leadership of communities of color. So supporting the movement for Black Lives, supporting the indigenous leadership that's at the forefront of the climate movement and many other struggles, supporting the immigrant-led immigrant rights movements. So I think part of what we're figuring out here for white folks is how to recognize, support, and be in solidarity with the leadership of communities of color. I think part of resistance in this moment is not normalizing what's going on. I think we have to strike a balance between not creating fear and panic and negativity, and yet also being real about the danger that we're in. I don't know that it serves us necessarily to be in denial about the danger that we're in, but right now we have an incompetent, unstable, vindictive, racist, white supremacist, Nazi-tinged president who has, the capability to launch nuclear weapons. So I think we need to be real about that. We need to look at the fact that the presidency of the United States is essentially a nuclear monarchy over the planet. And do we want to continue to have this kind of situation where one person, empowered by a completely corrupt political party, is essentially a nuclear monarch with destructive potential over the entire planet? I think we need to look at the challenges to democracy that the Republican Party and the Trump administration face. This is not to paper over the sins or inadequacies of the Democratic Party, but I think we have to be real about the political dynamics, and we need to recognize that we have a completely unethical political party that will put the fate of the planet in the hands of a corrupt, incompetent con man like Donald Trump. I think this is one of the most embarrassing things and one of the most potentially destructive things that's ever happened in the history of American democracy in the modern period. So I think we need to, I think part of resistance looks like pushing for impeachment. I think part of resistance looks like registering voters in massive numbers. I still don't think that we've built on the left a culture of voter registration. Again, that seems like maybe not as exciting as, shutting something down in the streets with a direct action protest. But I think we need to look at the significance of winning elections. This was an eminently winnable election. There's no reason why we need to let Republicans back into the White House. And when we look at the appointment of Neil Gorsuch, and if we contemplate that Donald Trump could potentially be appointing one or even two more Supreme Court justices, that has a dramatic effect on 1/3 of the U.S. government for the foreseeable future. And then we could work really hard and elect a progressive president, and that president could have all of her or his policy proposals dismantled by a completely extremist right-wing Supreme Court. So I think we have to be strategic. We have to be smart. Part of what we're doing, if we're talking about the electoral side of change, and I think social transformation goes way beyond electoral politics. But if we're looking at the electoral side, we've got to get the House and the Congress, and the Senate and the presidency and the Supreme Court to even begin to have a chance of changing the status quo toward the direction of ecological survivability and something that looks a lot more like social justice, right? So, it was a lost opportunity in 2016 to take the White House, and it could lead to more lost opportunities down the road if we think of having a Supreme Court dominated by two or one or two more Trump appointees. So I think progressives, liberals, progressives, radicals, the left, revolutionaries, we have to get much smarter and much more unified in terms of coalition building so that we can do massive pressure in the courts, in the streets, and in the ballot box, because I think all of those are part of the transformation that we need. We're not going to make it without a massive movement. Electoral politics are part of the puzzle, but we're going to need a massive movement. We're going to need a massive movement just to keep having a chance in electoral politics. You see, the voter suppression, I think we're going to talk about that in just a moment, so I'll save some of my comments on voter suppression, but we've got to be very strategic and very savvy. The voter suppression, this was the first presidential election since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in the 2013 decision, Shelby County versus Holder. So, and we've got this Republican-led gerrymandering. Right? We've got this partisan political gerrymandering. We've got the voter suppression. We've got the purging of the voter rolls. So we've got these immense challenges, even if we just want to have a chance to be on equal footing in terms of the electoral process. So I think we have to have a clear-eyed recognition of what I call Republican ruthlessness. There's a ruthlessness gap. There's a ruthlessness gap. Now, I'm not saying that people on the left or that Democrats or progressives have to be ruthless, but they have to understand Republican ruthlessness, and we have to begin asking the question, what would Republicans do in this situation? And we have to understand that we're going to have to up our level of commitment and our level of steadfastness if we're going to be able to compete in the electoral process. So I think we've got significant challenges. I think we need to have a multi-level inside and outside strategy. I think we need to resist in the courts, in the streets, in the ballot box, in our hearts, and in our imaginations.
Thank you so much. Thank you all very much. Really powerful comments. And we're going to do another round of questions to the panelists. And one thing I wanted to mention in agreement with everyone that has spoken is that I think one of the things that is being asked of us right now, all of us in this room, all of our colleagues, allies, friends, family, is that no matter what we're doing, we need to engage in our democracy more. As an example, the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, we obviously are focused on climate change and specifically, working with grassroots, Indigenous, and frontline women. And this year, we've really changed a lot of our programming to ensure that democracy has been part of the conversation and offering different trainings around that topic. And I think we all feel extremely full and busy and sometimes overwhelmed with the work we're already doing. But I think that, as you can hear from all of the speakers and from your own life and just looking at the news every day, that we all need to engage if we're going to have a change in our democracy and to really reclaim what we've already lost and to go forward in this very imperfect moment in this crisis in our country and in democracies around the world. So I think what's being asked of us is more engagement than we've ever seen before, and how we're going to include our engagement in this political process, because we cannot stay on the sidelines. Just pretty much everything's at stake. So with that, we're going to do another round of questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time to open it up to all of you for comments or questions you have for the panelists. But The second part, we really want to talk about, what does it mean to reclaim our democracy? We really see that, we're in a moment of resistance, which is really key. I've been in dialogue with a lot of our partners in other countries, and the first thing they said, right after the election was, the first thing you have to do is resist and not normalize the situation. You need to jump right on it. And we found that to be true. So that word resistance means a lot. And then what does reclaiming our democracy mean now? What do we really need to do going forward? And I'd love to hear from the panelists, your analysis, thoughts, and actions on that. Thank you so much to hear back from you, Sharon.
So I'm thinking about an alliance that was formed right after 45 was elected called the It Takes Roots Alliance. And this alliance is made up of the Climate Justice Alliance, which is over 50 groups, the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance, which also represents another 40 social justice and racial justice organizations, the Right to the City Alliance, which is made up of housing justice organizations, and the Indigenous Environmental Network, representing over 55 Indigenous communities in Turtle Island, many, many more, just more recently. And conversations started to happen in this alliance about, what does unified but diverse strategy look like, right? I think at first it was like, we got to unify, and, there's got to be one pathway that we're all going. And I think the more our communities talked and the more we surveyed our organizations and the folks in there, folks had a lot of different answers for what we were doing and invited us to think of multiple strategies and to start to act on those strategies. They also invited us to not just focus on the national stage, but to really go back and invest in our local communities and take that training, take the strategies, take everything we know, take the resources and reinvest them in our communities, because that's what they've been asking of us all this time. Our folks in the Malcolm X grassroots movement and our brothers and sisters in Co-op Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, right, did a lot of work to elect Chokwe Lumumba, right, a black nationalist, into the political arena. And we know that that has white supremacists shaking in their boots. And we love it. I love the idea of a black nationalist, in power, alongside of a community that is claiming their sovereignty, that is, claiming land alongside of Indigenous people for black people, right? Recognizing the interrelationships of our community, the history of our oppression, and, the way that the man has impacted all of us. And so calling us to think, beyond the normal strategies that we're thinking of, but embracing things like actually putting up some of our people, into the political arena and lifting them up and, starting to put our people out there to be elected into these positions to influence change. Because as much as we hate the inner workings of the government, that's where the laws are being made. That's where the regulations are changing. And it has to be our people on the inside as well as on the outside to make those things happen. So the vast response from our communities in this alliance was, we're going to keep grinding here at home. And we want you to look at the national stage, but we also want you to look at the international arena as well and go out into the world and learn from different communities and bring those strategies back home. So I just wanted to lift up that alliance at this time, is really looking at multi-pronged strategies, looking at things from the local all the way up to the international, entertaining strategies, like putting our people into office, taking on new ways of organizing, and then holding strong to our roots and everything we know about how to build power in our communities.
So, reclaiming democracy. I think as our crises, or whether it's the political or the ecological, the increasing tendency that we sometimes see that as it gets worse, there's also an urge among people to address the immediate or the fragmented reactions at the cost of longer-term system solution, or looking at the root causes. So if we look at sometimes, say for example, the climate or the ecological crisis, many times it's presented as just a technical problem that can be fixed within this system through technological innovation or unleashing the magic of the market, And we see that the same forces or the same dominant economic forces or the same large corporations that have brought us this crisis in the first place enter through the back door, offering us solutions to the crisis and using or seizing this opportunity to once again make profits. So when we look at the crisis in fragments, we fall prey to the same false solutions and opening the doors to the same entities that brought us here in the first place. So if the response or an adequate response would be that we will need to address all of these dimensions together, which means if we were to look at the issues of climate and food and agriculture, we need to remember that without seed freedom or seed sovereignty, we cannot have food sovereignty. Without keeping seeds in farmers' hands, we cannot respond adequately to the climate crisis. Farmers cannot respond to the climate crisis. And the alternative that is needed is not just at the level of tools, but what Drew was saying at the level of paradigm, at the level of worldview. So, and we are not going to have any miracle or silver bullet solutions. Every time we do that, we will keep coming back. We are not going to find the solution. So if we look at that aspect. The other aspect when we look at reclaiming democracy across all of these aspects is the never separating the ecological from the social. One is the ecological aspect. If we look at the ecological roots of some of the violent conflicts that we see today, one aspect is that. So whether it is Punjab in the 1980s, or Syria, or Nigeria, a large number of conflicts originate in the destruction of the lands, the soils, the water, and the inability of the land to provide further livelihoods. The UNCCD last year said that over the last 60 years, 40% of the intrastate conflicts originated in the destruction of the land and the takeover of the resources like land and water. So that aspect of seeing not just the ecological context, but also the social context of these crises. And how do we come out of this violent cycle? One way is to deepen the very democracy, which means to bring decisions that directly affect people's lives as close as possible to where they are, where they have the power to decide, but where they can also take responsibility. So if a river is flowing through some communities, it's those communities who should have the power and the responsibility to decide how to use that water. And so communities taking back the sovereignty over these resources. And finally, we need to bring a diversity of voices and opinions when we talk about our movement. There is more than one answer to the multiple crises that we talk about. So we need to bring more and more people to the table. And as we shape this movement, we need to also examine or reflect whose voices are being heard. Thank you.
Thank you. No, keep going.
So, in terms of what does it look like to reclaim our democracy in this moment, I think I touched on some of the things. I think we need to restore the Voting Rights Act. I think that's very important. It's not glamorous to have to refight the struggle that our foremothers and forefathers fought in Selma and elsewhere and throughout the South, but I think it's tremendously important. I think the Republican Party has shown that they're committed to disenfranchising as many voters as possible, particularly communities of color and working communities and poor communities. So I think we need to have a massive movement for voting rights. We have to have a massive movement against voter suppression. We have to have a massive movement against this gerrymandering, against the voting restrictions. Again, this is why the Supreme Court is so important. There were these voting restrictions that North Carolina had put in place that were struck down when the Supreme Court tied at 4-4 because Scalia died and there were only 8 justices on the court when the case came up. They tied at 4-4, and that's what enabled the lower court decision to stand, which had struck down those North Carolina voting restrictions. But now we got Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, right? So we cannot count on that happening in the future. In fact, it may be carte blanche for all of the voting restrictions that they want to try to push through, and to have them all rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. So I think we need to be very aware of what's happening in terms of voting rights, and we need to have a massive movement for voting rights and against voting suppression. I think pushing for impeachment is an important part of reclaiming democracy in our time. I felt that we needed a massive movement to ensure that there was an independent investigation. I think now that we have Special Counsel Bob Mueller on the job, we need to be prepared for the fact that we could have an instant constitutional crisis any day if Donald Trump fires Bob Mueller. It's a little more complicated than that. He would have to ask Assistant Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein to fire. Rosenstein would probably resign. Then they would then the next person would probably resign. You get the point. But if that general move happens where Trump tries to fire Bob Mueller or does fire Bob Mueller, I think we have an instant constitutional crisis on our hands, and we need to get in the streets and be prepared to have direct action strategies. I think this is the kind of thing that we need to get more savvy and strategic about. How could 5 million people shut down Washington, D.C. if we had a constitutional crisis resulting from the firing of Bob Mueller? I think we have somebody, we've handed our democracy, and believe me, again, this is part of the thing. It's not like I thought our democracy was just going along peachy keen and just fine beforehand. So we need, it's not like everybody was, just misty-eyed at how perfect our democracy was before Trump was elected. And at the same time, we need to recognize that we have handed our democracy to a person who has stated publicly that he may not accept the results of an election in which he is not victorious. So, is that possibly an unlikely scenario? I don't know. I'm just saying the political precautionary principle necessitates that we need to be prepared to face down these challenges to democracy and the rule of law in the courts and in the streets and in the voting booth.
Thank you. I think we have a few minutes for a few questions, or yeah, we have 10 minutes. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for those really important comments. We definitely could take a question or two. Does someone? Okay, we have someone standing there. Please go ahead. Maybe you could state your name as well. Thank you very much.
I'm Richard. Is that on? Thank you. Okay. I'm Richard Page. A wise old white man once said, "Nothing." Please help me understand, as I record more and more progressive meetings where white men are not allowed a voice, at least until everyone else has spoken. How may I ally with you and make sure that men don't take up all the space with talking like I am right now, and still be at service, please?
Who would like to take that?
I think it's a sensitive topic, I guess. I think it has to do with, I don't think anybody is saying don't ever say anything if you're a white man. It's much more about emotional, social, and political awareness, and recognizing that we as white men, we as straight men, we as cis men, we, et cetera, have been at the center for so long. And that we need to rejoin the community of voices, that we are one voice amongst many, and that, white supremacy, white perspective, it's really easy to take these things out of context, in the sense that you see something on Twitter and, a white man states an opinion, and then somebody says, oh, well, the last person I need to hear from about this is a white man. And then the white man gets his feelings hurt and he says, oh, what? I can't have an opinion because I'm a white man? And it's like, no, it's not. It's beyond the context of this one little interaction. No one's saying you can't have an opinion if you're a white man. You have to take it within the context of decades and decades and decades and centuries and centuries and centuries of it always being white men having an opinion on everything, and that opinion being valued above everybody else's, and them deciding that they need to have and they need to come in and we need to tell you and please. It's just too much. And so when you have had decades and centuries of that, and then you say, well, here's my opinion. It says, yeah, I don't need to hear from a white man on that. You need to take it beyond the personal. You need to take it beyond your hurt feelings, and you need to say this is about centuries and centuries of white men's voices and lives and everything else being valued to the exclusion of other voices. And so this is part of where a systemic approach to history and to institutionalize and systemic white supremacy and male supremacy and these types of things can help us get over our hurt feelings and say, yeah, maybe we don't need to hear from endless white men about every topic all the time to the exclusion of all other voices. We're moving much more toward a democratization of voices, I think.
Actually, the women requested that he respond because a lot also what happens in these conversations is that people of color, in this case women of color, are being demanded to respond. And they're saying, you guys do your own work. So in all due respect, I'll pass on to the next question. Please.
Hi, I'm Lisa Milos, and I wanted to say also it's not only white men, but also white women. Donald Trump won with 54% of the vote of white women in this country. So we also need to look at that, even within the feminist movement as well. And I think a lot of the impetus regarding the 2016 election had to do also with the fact that we as progressives or leftists are always looking at what benefits us internally in terms of our own domestic policy, but we don't take responsibility for how this affects everywhere else in the world. And even within Democratic presidents, we've had major devastation, and with the free trade policies and everything like that. So that is something we really need to address, and I'm glad that some of it was being addressed here as well. One of the other things that I wanted to say is that one of the ways that white people can be, well, everyone in particular, but specifically white people, and the economic power that white people wage in this country is very important. And the divestment movement is something, a very concrete way that we can literally use our economic power to benefit the emerging and the social movements. We need anybody who is in this room right now who still has a bank account at Wells Fargo, Citibank, Bank of America, needs to get out the money out now. Anybody in this room that has a pension plan that is investing in energy transfer partners or any other fossil fuel industries, and who also has their money invested in Citibank and all those different things. Of course, many of us don't have a choice because we're not even represented in the pension plans, but we need to move the money out of there. We need to really put our money where our mouth is. And
Great comments. I just want to see if you had I just wanted to know if you had a question for the panel.
Okay, I just wanted to ask the panel if, and basically whether or not the event today called stopetp.org is going to be also replicated here in a significant way, where we can participate in that national movement to stop energytransferpartners.org by joining together and making a public statement regarding divestment and in stopping Energy Transfer Partners, because the way that the people in Standing Rock, the water protectors, were treated, and which today continue to face criminal penalties.
Do you want to comment?
No, so I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Thank you. I just want to, we have such limited time. Thank you. It's a really good point. For those of you who are not aware, Energy Transfer Partner was one of the main companies behind the Dakota Access Pipeline. And so there's a big action today on that. And I'm going to hand this to Sharon, but let's get one more question too. if we could get a question, that would be super. Thank you. Could you say your name?
Yeah, really quick. How you doing? How is everybody doing? My name is Vernon Haney.
Welcome.
Great panel, and no worries, thanks. Yeah, and I was just wondering, first of all, my question is, with activism, I heard that you say, like, you know, they're taking back the land using some old tactics, like building houses right in that access to those pipelines. Now, I'm new to activism or just activating, you know, so there's a lot of fear in me being a black man because I don't want to wind up shot, dead, or anything else. I would like to see, like, how do you, like, put that fear out of the way to take small steps, increasing, you know, and to join bigger movements. And I would also like to say, you know, with all people in here, first of all, I heard yesterday there's not much difference in all of us. We're all humans. But, you know, there are ways that you can support groups without even opening your mouth. Like me, being in a group of a mixed group makes me feel more comfortable in my activism sometimes because I'm like, oh, they won't hurt these people. They'll help us. Now, I don't know if that's like a resonated feeling, but it comes off like that sometimes to me. So I'm just wanting some information.
Thank you very much.
So I'll speak to both of those questions and then hand it over, and I'm just going to ask Osprey to keep an eye on my child over there. Okay. So, you know, yes to the tip on divestment and divesting our money. You know, I think when our grassroots movements started to talk about divestment and the divestment strategy, and that became a popular strategy among larger NGOs, you know, some of the big greens like 350.org, our community said, well, what about reinvestment? When you divest that money, where does that money go, right? Is that gonna go into some other kind of funky, fake, clean energy project? Or is it gonna get reinvested into our communities so our communities can decide how we wanna power our communities, right? So I wanted to lift that side of the divestment strategy up, that it's not just about taking our money out, but it's about where our money goes in its place, right? And then, yeah, you know, like shout out to the Day of Action around Energy Transfer Partners. Some of our relatives were just out in Dallas, you know, demonstrating, and there's a large coalition that's forming around that, and so I'm sure that we'll be seeing a lot more, and there's a lot more interest around holding Energy Transfer Partners accountable, not just for Standing Rock, but for all of its other evils. And then to the young brother, you know, thanks for just expressing that vulnerability and that honesty. And, you know, the truth is I want to keep you out of jail too. You know, I don't want you in there. I don't want more of our brothers in there because part of what we're fighting is the prison industrial pipeline, right? That's one of the biggest injustices we're facing now, right, is our young black and brown people, you know, getting flooded into the system for just being themselves, right, for crossing the street, you know, for reaching for their own cell phone, they're getting shot. You know, and we're talking about diverse strategies and how people of all walks of life can step up and support our communities. You know, and it's two roads, I'd say. It's really important for us as black and brown people to step up and express our own truth and be in leadership of direct action. But in the Ruckus Society, we teach, you know, we teach layered strategy, and wow, the term is not coming to me. Oh, we call it stacking risk. And that means that there are some people that have more privilege and that can go through the prison system or, you know, will be dealt with by police differently than some of our folks. And some of those folks choose to step up and leverage their privilege and take risk on behalf of our communities. Here in the Bay Area, we see that a lot with Black Lives Matter and an affinity group that was formed called BASAT of white folks, you know, who went and shut down the Oakland Police Department because black activists asked them to do that. You know, and so, you know, it's two different strategies because as a brown person, I don't necessarily want white people stepping up for me all of the time. Because I do think it is my responsibility, you know, to represent my people, to represent my issues, to represent my community. And it's extra important that our people speak for ourselves and that we not give our voice up to other people. But that doesn't mean that we're going to be the ones who have to go to jail all the time or that that's the strategy that we're trying to use all the time, right? It's not about leveraging civil disobedience so that our people can go to jail. We're actually trying to keep our people out of the system. But sometimes we have to leverage our risk in ways that are really uncomfortable, right? And, you know, now we're seeing elders and disabled people, right, step into direct action and, you know, put themselves in really awful, vulnerable positions, you know, to leverage support for all of us. You know, so I'd say that this is a larger conversation that has to happen and is happening in our communities. Is what does risk look like in our communities? What does it look like for us to step up on behalf of ourselves? And how do we ask folks with more privilege who are asking and wanting to support us, how do we give them clear direction on how to lift up our issues, but not take up that space, you know, that is normally taken from us? You know, and it's a slippery road. You know, we're still working it out, because in our communities, internalized racism still exists. You know, in our activist communities, issues of oppression and dominance still exist, and you know, we're still decolonizing our own minds and our own selves. And so it's, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but I think we're seeing this rolling out into the streets now. You know, where our folks with more privilege are doing that for us, but then our folks who are deeply impacted and directly impacted are those who are speaking voice and speaking truth to power. So just
Thank you so much. Let's give a big hand to everyone. Really great comments, really important conversation. Thank you, everyone, and let's really keep resisting and renewing. Thank you.